We hear a lot in this Democratic primary about electability, how important it is. And what's interesting is that it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that all the voters are saying, I want a candidate who can win. I think this candidate can win, and I'm gonna support it. Well, why do you support that candidate? Well, they have a lot of supporters. That seems to mean that they can win. So it's a sort of circular thing. But I've been looking at the polls, and I think there's actually a couple different directions we could go in. So I wanna inject a little bit of new data in this consideration. Before we do this though, I do want to show you a little bit of a video from earlier on today, I believe. It was Steve Kornacki talking about some of these new general election polls and revealing something that I think Democratic primary voters really need to know. So let's watch.
Heading into the critical Iowa caucuses, we have a look at some new polls. In the last 24 hours, a bunch of new polls come out here. A national poll from Monmouth yesterday, they find something we've been seeing for a while now. Biden clearly in the lead in this poll. Sanders clearly in second. Warren in third, clearly behind him. By the way, Bloomberg, with all that money spent outside the first 4 states, getting to 9% here. But check this out. The other national poll to come out yesterday from CNN, first time you've seen that in a long time. Yeah. Bernie Sanders in the lead nationally. What's the difference between what you found in the CNN poll that has Sanders ahead? Non-white voters. In this poll, this CNN poll, he leads Biden. Whoa, he leads Biden by 3 points among non-white voters. I don't know which of those polls is right, but if Sanders is going to win the nomination, that's where he's got to build support. You see in that poll what happens when he does.
Yeah, there does seem to be something happening, and the national polls and the trend lines in Iowa appear to be converging as well, if you believe some of the private numbers we've looked at.
So Chuck Todd acknowledging there does seem to be something happening. We'll see if he continues to acknowledge that going forward. But what Steve Kornacki said there was good. Now look, if you look at all the polls, they don't all tell the exact same story. That first poll they were showing has Joe Biden continuing to have an ever narrowing but a lead over Bernie Sanders nationally. But that second poll got talked about a lot yesterday. It was a CNN poll. He's gained 7 points since the last CNN poll, which is back in December. That is significant. This is not just some fly-by-night operation which did like one poll. No, this is like a gold standard pollster. They use both landlines and cell phones. They do call cell phones, and they conduct live interviews. It's not an automated thing that can skew the results itself. This is a very reliable poll, and they're acknowledging that things are changing. Also credit to them for acknowledging what the mainstream media very rarely wants to acknowledge, which is that the concept of the Bernie bro doesn't make any sense when you look at the people who are actually voting for him. He has gotten this lead in large part because he's doing better and better amongst non-white voters. We're gonna have some more numbers for you on that in just a little second. Actually, why don't we turn to that right now? About 40% of Democratic primary voters are non-white, and somewhere around 20% are black. It's a disproportionate share of the Democratic primary vote, so it's very important. Now, most challengers to Biden have lacked support. This group, Sanders, though, is more than holding his own. He's at 30% with non-white voters compared to 24% among white voters. So he has a significant boost in popularity in non-white voters over his white support. That seems like the sort of thing that should drive a narrative in the mainstream media, but you don't see it. They still talk as if the only people that support Bernie Sanders are white frat boys. It's just not what we're seeing when we look at the actual polls. When we go to, here's a Morning Consult poll from earlier this month. This is Hispanic voters. Bernie Sanders has 33% of that group. The second place candidate, Joe Biden, has 23. So you see that Bernie Sanders there has a full 1/3 of all the Hispanic vote in his Democratic primary, which is important because a Univision analysis showed that Latino turnout doubled in the 2018 midterms in 8 states: Nevada, California, Texas, Florida, and New York. Now, to some extent, that could be important in a general election, but it's really important in a primary election, where you have more and more political engagement and activity amongst Latino Americans, and they seem to be siding more and more with Bernie Sanders. In part because they tend to be on the younger side, they tend to be on the more progressive side, and so obviously they have an affinity with Bernie Sanders there, but important that we actually acknowledge it. Now, in terms of electability, we care about the primary, but really we're talking about the general election. It's us trying to figure out who is going to do the best against Donald Trump, assuming he's the nominee, which he almost certainly is going to be. Well, amongst important groups, it seems like Bernie Sanders is probably doing pretty well there. If you look at general election poll amongst independents specifically, now look, basically everyone is beating Trump in that group, but nobody is beating him in the same way that Bernie Sanders is. Sanders has 10 points on him there. Oddly enough, Mike Bloomberg is doing second best there with a 6-point advantage, but it drops off from there. That is one of the things that we've been saying for years about Bernie Sanders, is that he not only is very popular amongst the Democratic primary voters, he has the highest favorability electability rating of anybody running amongst Democratic primary voters. But also, once you go to the general election, he pulls in independents and new voters in a way that no one else does. Okay, and here's the thing, like, we could look at a million different polls, and they don't all show, as I said, the same exact story. There are general election polls that show Bernie Sanders beating Trump more than anyone else. Very recently, CNN put out one of those, so that's very important. If you go back over the last year, Joe Biden has done pretty well in those general election polls too. But what I'm saying is that if you believe that electability should be the most important concern, you cannot look at these numbers and say, well, then our decision is made for us. We should go for this candidate. You might think that Joe Biden is going to be strong in the general election, but I'm showing you data that shows that Bernie Sanders would be at least as strong, if not stronger, among certain important groups. It becomes, at the very least, a bit of a wash, this vague concept of what is electable. Anybody can beat Donald Trump. The question is, what are they gonna do if they win? And when there's no clear winner, or at least no clear winner the mainstream media is gonna acknowledge, and Bernie Sanders is doing so well, then maybe we can go to a more substantive second tier of reasons to choose a candidate. Maybe we should look at what they've actually done, what they've actually said, what they've stood for, what they would do if they became president. Electability is important, but it looks like we're probably doing okay in terms of these general election polls. Let's actually choose a candidate that is gonna bring in new people and is gonna get stuff done if they become president. Okay, so that's what I'm thinking about as we go into the Iowa caucus. We'll see if people agree with me. Check out the Damage Report podcast each day, wherever you get your podcasts, whether Pocket Casts or Stitcher or iTunes. You can join me as I give you the news and stories you want, with a range of co-hosts and interview guests jumping in on the fun each day. Again, that's the Damage Report, wherever you get your podcasts. And if you get them at iTunes, don't forget to rate and review. Sometimes I'll read them live on the show.